The events of Sunday, September 15, 1963, and the young, innocent lives that were lost that day transformed our nation. On that day, we not only lost the lives of 4 little girls, but we must not forget
from New Mexico.
Mr. President, I would ask to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Ask to be recognized for the time I may consume.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak about the very serious vote before us, the vote to authorize force against Syria. But let's be clear, this is a vote to authorize an act of war. The American people are watching. They know what this is, a dilemma with no easy answers. They know it could spiral out of control. It has happened before, and it could happen again. The use of chemical weapons is an outrage. What happened in Syria was despicable. The horror is clear. The world cannot look away. This crime is a crime against humanity. It demands an international response, strong and unequivocal. On this, we can all agree. However, what should that response be? The President has presented a plan for military strikes on the Syrian regime, an attack that has been presented to the American people as limited in scope, but with very great consequences. So we are confronted with urgent appeals to strike, but I believe there are strong reasons not to do so. First, we should pursue all diplomatic and economic options to pressure both Assad and his backers to change course. We have not yet done that to the fullest extent. We all know that the Russian government is aiding and abetting the criminal regime in Syria, supplying military support, providing diplomatic cover, preventing an international response to this atrocity. The world is rightly outraged. That outrage should be loud and clear, and the full force of international condemnation must be exerted, not just against Assad. As of this week, there are signs that Russia may be getting the message. If their proposal to help secure Syria's chemical weapons is sincere, then we should welcome this opportunity. We should work with the international community to make this a reality. The inability to use chemical weapons in this conflict will restore the international norm we seek to uphold and prevent a recurrence of the horrors we have seen. If Russia aims to be a responsible world power and not a rogue nation, they will seek solutions, not obstruction. They are a signatory to the Chemical Weapons Convention. Let's hold their feet to the fire to do what is right. The President's mandate is stronger with congressional approval, and the mandate of the United States is stronger with international support. I would urge Ambassador Power and Secretary Kerry to keep up the pressure on Russia. Make the forceful case to the Security Council. Continue to share the evidence with the people of the world. This situation will not be solved with Tomahawk cruise missiles fired into Syria. It will require a concerted international effort to push Assad and the various rebels to pursue a political solution. But for us to go it alone, to take unilateral action, that will put us on shaky ground, legally and strategically. Second, the proposal to use military force could embroil the United States in a complex Middle Eastern civil war. There is a cancer in Syria, from Assad to al-Qaeda. The civil war is a twilight zone comprised of multiple players, internationally, regionally, and within Syria. Many of the rebels do not share our values. Some, we don't know how many, are enemies of the United States and our allies. Many of these rebel groups have also committed terrible atrocities. Tilting the balance too far in their favor is not in our nation's interest and will not leave Syria safer for innocent civilians. These strikes have been presented as limited and targeted. But last week there were reports about expanding military targets, of regime change. Even the resolution we are considering today includes veiled language. The language that could make it the policy of the United States to tilt the momentum in the civil war and endorse the policy of arming the Syrian rebels, a policy that I and others believe is very dangerous, arming rebels whom we know too little about. Third, there is a real risk that even limited U.S. military involvement may make Assad feel more desperate, putting our allies, Israel, Turkey, and Jordan, at risk of attack. This could spark a regional war, creating a situation on the ground where Assad may be more, not less, inclined to use chemical weapons. And as with so many elements here, the question occurs, what then? Here's the reality. There's no simple solution. And the American people know this. I understand that there is a natural instinct to want to retaliate, to strike out. No one can forget the horrific images, the terrible suffering of the victims. But we need a clear strategy, and will not mire the United States. This strategy is a strategy that will not mire the United States in a bloody and uncertain civil war. I remain unconvinced that we have such a strategy in place. The Iraq War, which I voted against, began as an international effort to kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. There followed years of a no-fly zone and airstrikes to prevent Saddam from threatening his neighbors or reconstituting his arsenal of chemical weapons. And as we all know, these limited military actions led to one of the biggest blunders in U.S. history. Americans are understandably skeptical after the fiasco of Iraq. They want to know if we are going down the same path in Syria and into a civil war that is far more complex and potentially damaging to the U.S. and its interests. Limited attack or broader, there is no easy way out of the quicksand. Have we not learned at least that after 12 years of war? I have listened to the administration's arguments closely, as well as the opinions of New Mexicans. The American people do not believe a limited strike will deter Assad. They fear that this strike will just lead us further towards direct involvement. They rightly ask for what purpose and to what end. Public officials should not always let polls be their guide before making important decisions for our country. But I agree with the majority of Americans and New Mexicans. We must exhaust our political, diplomatic, and economic options first. This is not a lack of resolve. America has the greatest military on earth. No one should doubt that we will defend our interests and our allies. But a military strike in Syria is the wrong response in the wrong place at the wrong time. I come to the floor not to push my colleagues one way or another. Each of us must make up his or her own mind. I come here simply to explain my reasons for voting no on this authorization for the use of military force in Syria. Mr. President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
quorum call continuing on the floor of the Senate. As we wait further debate, we'll go once again live to Capitol Hill as House and Senate leaders are awarding the Congressional Gold Medal to the 4 little girls who passed away in a Birmingham church bombing in 1963. House Majority Leader Eric Cantor about to speak.
Go on that pilgrimage to Birmingham, to Selma, to Montgomery, to retrace the steps of the heroes of the Civil Rights Movement. And it is in that spirit that we gather today to commemorate the lives of these 4 little girls, Addie Mae, Cynthia, Carol, Denise, with the Congressional Gold Medal. The 50th anniversary of the attack on the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham is a strong reminder of the horror and violence endured by those who fought so hard in the Civil Rights Movement in America for the most basic of freedom, for the most basic freedoms this country embodies: liberty, equality, and the pursuit of happiness. On that day, America lost 4 innocent children who had gathered at a place of worship because the enemies of justice were determined to stop one of the greatest movements for freedom this nation ever witnessed. These enemies of justice were so determined that they even attacked a house of God. They tried to break the will of the Civil Rights Movement. The bombs that September morning may have shaken the walls of the church, but they could never shake the will of the people who often gathered under that steeple seeking the divine right of equality. It was the memory of the children, Addie Mae, Cynthia, Carol, and Denise, that strengthened and emboldened leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, Rosa Parks, and our own John Lewis, along with the countless others who continued their pursuit of justice through peace. As they marched for equality, they demonstrated to the world that they would not forget the 4 little girls that were taken that day, and they would not be intimidated. The Congressional Gold Medal, one of America's highest civilian awards, is given to those who have had a great impact on American history and culture. Addie Mae, Cynthia, Carol, and Denise are most deserving of such honor. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the United States Senator from Alabama, the Honorable Richard Shelby.
Senator Reid, Senator McConnell, Speaker Boehner, I'm looking for him, he's back here. Speaker Boehner, Senator Mikulski, Congressman Cantor, Congressman Sewell, Congressman Pelosi, and my colleague Spencer Backus. I was in Alabama 50 years ago, 60 miles from Birmingham, Tuscaloosa, my home, when we heard the news. My wife and I were coming out of the First Presbyterian Church, and the news was, people were talking on the street, that 4 innocent little girls were blown up in their Sunday school, in the church in Birmingham. We knew then that it was a shameful act, a tragic day. We couldn't believe it happened, but it did. But it awakened, I believe, the conscience, not only of Alabama, but the whole nation. It's been 50 years. It's been a long time. And I want to commend Congresswoman Terry Sewell for her foresight, her perseverance in introducing in her leadership this resolution. And that's why we're here today. Thank you, Terry. I also want to thank you, Terry, for asking me to sponsor that resolution, your resolution, in the United States Senate, and the Senate responded unanimously. That's the legacy, the tragic legacy, but we won't forget, and that's why we're here today. I'm sorry it took 50 years. I'm sorry what happened, because it was a shameful day, but such a great legacy we shall never forget. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, United States Senator from Maryland, the Honorable Barbara Mikulski.
I know you have a hard time seeing me, but you won't have a hard time hearing me. To my distinguished colleagues in the Congress of the United States, to the men and women here today who are part of the larger American community, and to the families of the 4 girls from Alabama, the United States Senate and the Congress send its greetings and its respects. I was honored to be asked
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, make no mistake about it. The resolution before us and our judgment on it is one of the most difficult decisions a member of the United States Senate will ever have to make. The authorization of force is an awesome responsibility that each of us has. None of us want to see American troops in harm's way. None of us want to see the need for the use of military force. So this is a difficult judgment for us to make. The Constitution envisions that both the President and Congress are involved in the deploying of U.S. military. Certainly the President as Commander-in-Chief and the Congress under the War Powers Act have a responsibility to authorize the use of force. Now, today in this country, Americans are tired of war. We've been involved in Iraq and Afghanistan for way too long. We thought these campaigns would be short campaigns. They turned into be very long campaigns. There's been a tremendous loss in human life and fiscal resources as a result of the wars that the United States has participated in. But the public also understands that we have a responsibility to use our military to protect the national interests of the people of this country. They understand that America's military strength keeps the people in this country safe. And they expect that the President and the Congress will use that military force in order to protect the national security of the people of this country. Now, what is in our national security interest, and why would the President come to Congress asking us to consider the use of military force in the current circumstances in Syria? I understand people recognize that we're about ready to be attacked, that there's a need to use force. The United States plays a unique role in the international community, for we understand that standing up for basic internationally recognized human rights is a responsibility that we all have. Mr. President, I supported President Clinton when he asked for the authorization of force for the United States, along with the international community, to be involved in restoring order in the republics of the former Yugoslavia, where there was ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and Kosovo. But for the leadership of the United States, additional communities would have been destroyed. People would have lost their lives. We stood up because it was in the United States' interest to stand up for the enforcement of basic established international human rights. So let us evaluate what's happening in Syria today and understand that what's happening there may be far from our shores, but the impact is very much could be felt here in the United States. I serve on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and we were called back into session last week because of the President's request for the Congress to act on his request for force, or use of force. We held hearings that were open to the public. We held classified hearings in order to better understand what had happened in Syria. Mr. President, I think it is now clear, beyond any doubt, that the Assad regime in Syria used chemical weapons. The evidence is clear. It was not the first occasion that they used chemical weapons. They had used chemical weapons in the past, but not in the magnitude that they did on August 21st of this year, in which over 1,400 people were killed, many of whom were children. Videos of that image are now available publicly. People can see the horrific act that was imposed upon the people of Syria by its president, President Assad. The action of Syria on August 21st violated international norm. Since chemical weapons were used in World War I, the international community has come together and said, even in war, we will not permit the use of chemical weapons. It is so horrific, so indiscriminate in its killing and its maiming, that as an international community, we will stand up and say, no, you cannot use chemical weapons. The evidence is clear that President Assad of Syria used chemical weapons in a mass way, killing over 1,400 people. That action requires the response of the international community. For if it goes unchallenged, it is more likely that President Assad will continue to use chemical weapons. He just considers it one of the weapons in his toolbox, and he will call it out more and more if it goes unchallenged by the international community. The people of Syria are not the only ones at risk, Mr. President. These chemical weapons could easily be used against American allies in that region. Could be used against Turkey. Could be used against Jordan. Could be used against Israel. And if the use of weapons of mass destruction in Syria goes unchallenged, if President Assad can get away with the use of chemical weapons, what message does that send to the regime in Iran and its ambition to become a nuclear weapon state and perhaps use nuclear weapons? What message does it send to the government of North Korea, which is openly testing the use of nuclear weapons? We have a direct interest in preventing the use of weapons of mass destruction, and we have to work with the international community to say that this will not go unchallenged. We have not only a moral imperative, and we do have a moral imperative, but we also have an issue of our national security interest. If these weapons of mass destruction get in the hands of terrorist organizations and groups, it threatens the security of Americans. It threatens the security of our allies. We have a responsibility to protect the national security of the people of this country. Mr. President, I've talked to many people in Maryland who have talked to me about their concerns about the use of American military in Syria. They recall what happened when the Congress authorized the use of force in Iraq, where there was evidence of chemical weapons, and then we went in and found no chemical weapons. There were statements made about this would be a limited operation. Our troops were there for a decade. So there is obviously concern about the information being made available to us and what is being asked of the Congress of the United States. When force was authorized against Iraq, when that resolution was pending on the floor, I served in the other body, in the House of Representatives. I had a chance to firsthand see the information about Iraq and its risk factors to the interests of the United States. You may recall that the popular sentiment was for America to authorize the use of force, for Congress to authorize the use of force. I voted no on that resolution because I was convinced that America did not have a national security interest to use military force. So let me explain the difference between the circumstances in Iraq over a decade ago and what we're facing today in Syria. The justification, the original justification for the United States entering its combat troops in Iraq was that Iraq was deeply involved with the then government of Afghanistan and the attack on our country on September the 11th. Well, I looked for that information, Mr. President, and I saw no relationship between the Iraqi government and the attack on our country. Yet those statements were made, and it was used as justification for the use of military force. Here, the justification is the use by Syria of chemical weapons, which has been established. And I believe the international community has now understood. The evidence is clear that the Assad regime used chemical weapons in contravention to international norm. When we were authorizing the Iraq use of force, there was no restrictions on the U.S. military. And as you know, we use ground troops. We use hundreds of thousands of ground troops in our campaign in Iraq, putting American lives directly at risk and putting America directly in harm's way. The request of the President of the United States for military action in Syria does not include, and in fact, the resolution that has come out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee makes it clear that there will be no ground combat troops from the United States of America. We will not be drawn in to a ground war. The Iraqi resolution that was approved over a decade ago had no time limit on that authorization. As we saw with that authorization and with the Afghanistan authorization, those campaigns went for over a decade with American troops at risk. The authorization that has come out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee contains a 60-day limitation on the authorization on the use of force. 60 days. Can be extended once for an additional 30 days. A limited campaign. It's very clear that this authorization is restricted to the specific objective, to degrade and deter the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime, to prevent the transfer of chemical weapons to terrorist organizations. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee recommended resolution is limited. It's limited to that mission. It's limited in the type of military operation, no ground troops. It's limited in time, not to exceed 60 to 90 days. And it is limited to the fact that it should be, the use of force should be the last option, not the first, the last option. I've said many times on the floor of the House and now on the floor of the Senate that the use of military should be the last resort, that there are other options that need to be explored first. So the resolution that has come out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee requires the President to pursue diplomatic ways to resolve the issue before he can use force. And he must certify to Congress that he has done that before he can use force. Mr. President, you understand this directly because you've raised some of these issues. We now have an opportunity that we hope will work. We now have the attention of Russia and Syria, since they know that America is serious about reacting to their use, to Syria's use of chemical weapons. They know that we won't stand by. They now have acknowledged that chemical weapons in great numbers exist in Syria. And quite frankly, I think they've acknowledged the attack in the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Of course, the videos speak for themselves, and the physical evidence is overwhelming. So now the suggestion is they would turn over those chemical weapons to the international community. If that's done, we have achieved our objective in the resolution that's before us. The resolution before us is to degrade and deter the use of chemical weapons by Syria. If they turn their chemical weapons over to the international community, we have achieved our objective. However, any such plan must be verifiable, enforceable, and timely. Excuse me by being a little bit suspicious of the suggestions made by Russia and Syria. I want to make sure that it is verifiable, that it's enforceable, and that it's timely. But, Mr. President, we anticipated a diplomatic effort when the Senate Foreign Relations Committee recommended this resolution to the floor of the United States Senate. There are many members of the Senate, including the presiding officer, that are looking at ways that we can come together to support the President's effort to stand up against the use of chemical weapons. And I hope we will be able to come together with language in this resolution that will allow the Syrian government to turn over their chemical weapons in a timely way and forcible way so that military force will not be necessary. But make no mistake about it, but for the leadership of President Obama, but for their fear of the use of American military force, we would never be at this opportunity right now where we have a viable diplomatic channel that we can pursue. So I just want to acknowledge that, but acknowledge that we anticipated that diplomacy would be used as it always should be used before the use of military. We hope military will not be necessary, but we have to react to the use of chemical weapons. Now, let me explain some of the things we don't want to see happen. And, Mr. President, I referenced the hearings that we had in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I want to congratulate Senator Menendez and Senator Corker, the chairman and the ranking Republican on our committee. We had a very open hearing. Then we had access to classified information. Then we had an open discussion in our committee, and all views were heard. And we tried to recommend a resolution that we thought was responsible for the United States Congress to weigh in on. It was not the resolution that the President had submitted to us. It was one that was much more limited to the authorization that we thought was appropriate. And I think it has served its purpose from the point of view of putting Syria on notice that the United States is prepared to join the international community to say chemical weapons will not be allowed to be used. But we also made it clear that we will not be drawn into a civil war. President Assad has done some horrible things in that country. He's lost, in my view, the legitimacy of leading the country. But it's up to the Syrians to resolve their civil conflict. American troops will not be drawn in to the problems within, or the civil problems within Syria itself. They're going to have to resolve that issue. And as the United States has said, as the international community has said, there needs to be a political solution to the future of Syria. And yes, there are some good people in the opposition. There are some people that we're concerned about in the opposition. At the end of the day, it's up to the Syrians, through a political process, to determine their own government. What we should expect is a government that will respect the human rights of all the people of Syria and will respect the right of Syrians to determine who their leaders should be. But all ethnic communities should be able to live in peace in Syria. And that's our objective, to get to that political solution. We won't be drawn into a broader conflict. As I said earlier, The people I've talked to in Maryland don't want war. The people I've talked to in this nation don't want the United States drawn into another war, and neither do I. One more point about the response to the use of chemical weapons. Yes, our first priority is to make sure these chemical weapons aren't used again. The best way to do that is get control of the weapons and make sure they are not used and hopefully destroyed. But President Assad needs to be held accountable. He has committed war crimes. He has committed crimes against humanity. He needs to be held accountable for the criminal actions that he has perpetrated on the people of Syria. As we know, over 100,000 have lost their lives. Many of these are civilians who were put in harm's way by the Syrian government against international norms. So I have encouraged my colleagues to join me in an effort calling on an international tribunal to take President Assad in his case and establish the international justice so that he is held accountable for his actions. One last point about the resolution before us, and that is it is important to work with the international community. And I would hope that we would find more countries standing up for the importance of international participation on the use of chemical weapons. One of the hopes that we have in this new opportunity for a diplomatic solution is for the United Nations to assume its appropriate role. The United Nations Security Council will have an opportunity as early as today to pass an enforceable resolution condemning what happened in Syria and accepting the offer to take control of all of its chemical weapons and do it in a way that is enforceable and in a way that accomplishes its goal. I hope that the United Nations Security Council will act. I hope the international community will join us. The United States leadership is needed. President Obama is providing that. But the key point is that we must respond to the use of chemical weapons. I think this debate is strengthening our country. I understand that there are different views. I would urge my colleagues to get together to support a resolution that puts America on record, supporting President Obama on saying that we will not permit the use of chemical weapons to go unchallenged, that our objective is to make sure the world is safer from the use of chemical weapons, and we're prepared to work with the international community in order to achieve those objectives. With that, Mr. President, I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Senate in a quorum call as off-the-floor discussions continue on how to move forward with a possible resolution on authorizing military force against Syria. The Associated Press reporting that a source is telling them that Secretary Kerry will meet with the Syrian foreign minister in Geneva on Thursday. United Nations is also Security Council is set to meet this afternoon. We will keep you posted. While this quorum call continues, we're going to take you live back to the Congressional Gold Medal ceremony for the 4 victims of the Birmingham church bombing of 1963. The Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell is speaking.
So I want the family members gathered here today to know that the lives of these children meant something to the history of this country. They helped change our nation. And they remind us still of the odiousness of those who seek to divide Americans by race, not just through violence, but through the kind of decisive rhetoric we all must unite to defeat. So today, we offer this Congressional Gold Medal to the memory of 4 children who set out simply to attend Sunday school, not to become martyrs for a cause, but who ascended nonetheless to the pantheon of Americans who, in death, continued their contributions to our country. For that, as a nation, we are forever indebted. And I hope this high civilian honor we present today will serve as a permanent reminder of our enduring gratitude. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Majority Leader of the United States Senate, the Honorable Harry Reid.
The blast that rocked the 16th Street Baptist Church 5 decades ago blew out every stained glass window in the church except one. Some McConnell staff and my staff have talked, and I know he was going to use this reference, but it's worth repeating. Listen to this. It blew out every stained glass window in the church except one. The one window that remained was an image of Jesus leading a group of children to safety. On that September morning in 1963, there was no safety for those 4 little girls, Hattie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, or Cynthia Wesley. Not even in Sunday school. But there really was salvation, not only for the 4 young ladies, but for a nation. That outrage sparked by the deaths of these 4 innocents ignited the civil rights movement like nothing had up to that time. As Dr. King said at the funeral for these 3 girls, for 3 of the girls I should say, quote, "God still has a way of wringing good out of evil." Dr. King said, God still has a way of wringing good out of evil. Although there is perhaps no greater evil than bombing a church filled with little kids on a Sunday morning, America has wrung 50 years of good and progress out of that terrible act. Today we honor the girls' sacrifice and remember all 4 of these young ladies, how they lived as well as how they died. I offer thanks to Congresswoman Sewell and all those that co-sponsored this legislation for their work and dedication to making today's remembrance possible. As you know, around here it's hard for us to agree on most anything. But this was, frankly, fairly easy, and I admire what they've done to get it done so quickly. The loss of 4 precious children was mourned by their families and friends, but also mourned by an entire nation. So let's talk just a little bit about these girls. Denise was an activist, though she was only in elementary school. She raised money for charities by doing things in her garage, her family's garage, staging little plays, poetry readings. She was 11 years old. Addie Mae was a 14-year-old softball player and an artist, loved to draw. She was 14 also. Cynthia was very good at math and played in the high school band. She was 14 years old. Carol was a straight-A student, a Girl Scout. She sang in her high school choir. She was 14 years old. Nothing, neither words nor the passage of time, can ease the pain of their loss. For loved ones and friends, and yes, even total strangers, felt and feel the loss. But I believe there's comfort in the knowledge that, as Dr. King said, their sacrifice set this nation on a path toward making, I quote, justice a reality for all of God's children.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, the Honorable John Boehner.
I want to thank all of my colleagues for their words today, especially my friend, the Majority Leader, Eric Cantor, who was instrumental in making this medal a reality. As we prepare for the presentation, I want to leave you with this thought. The award doesn't just immortalize people in great events. It serves as a much more fundamental purpose, and that is to honor the very ideas and blessings that this nation was founded on. One of those ideas, the first one really, is that life is precious. Put another way, life is short. These lives were far too short. And it is when we realize that life is short that we focus on what matters and on who matters. It's why we retreat from the noise to celebrate 4 young women whose story should be told and retold. Some would call this closure. Today they'll call it a ceremony. I would call it just love. Love saw us through this and will see us through the trials that we all face. Pour out that thimble of wisdom Dr. King used in his eulogy from the prophet Isaiah. And a little child shall lead them. Once again, our children have led us to this simplest of notions. They bring us together. They give us hope when ours runs out. No, we didn't need a medal to reaffirm this order of things, but we could always use a solid gold reminder. And so, the United States Mint, authorized by an act of Congress, has struck in the name of the American people a gold medal to commemorate the lives of Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley. May we serve their memories with love and honor.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated for the presentation of the Congressional Gold Medal by members of the United States Congress with Dr. Lawrence Peugeot of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute and Reverend Arthur Price, Jr. of the 16th Street Baptist Church.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, President and CEO of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, Dr. Lawrence Peugeot.
Wasn't that something? Good afternoon. When a major part of your responsibility in the world of work is to find resources for your institution, you must give thanks to Congresswoman Pelosi for acknowledging the need to visit the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. Especially when you have a zero-based budget for PR. Okay? And let me add a little bit to that, and I do understand the importance of this program and the seriousness of it. However, I work at an institution where we always have our hand out, trying to meet ends, and to have our name referenced at a program like this is very important. And I'd like the viewing audience to visit our website, bcri.org. You will learn about our programs and also how you can help us. Now, with that said, let me move to the task. Today, I humbly accept this Congressional Gold Medal, presented in honor of Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robinson, and Cynthia Wesley. On behalf of the Board of Directors and staff of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, and now I'd like to take the liberty of introducing you to our chair, LaWanna Bradford. Would you stand, please, LaWanna? And with Mrs. Bradford and I are members of our Board of Directors. Would you ladies and gentlemen please stand? Members of our staff, they're here with us. And we have some friends who have joined us today. Our facility has been designated to house and preserve this medal. I pledge our commitment to tell the story of what happened in Birmingham during 1963, and especially on September 15, 1963, and to use that story as a guidepost as we look at 50 years forward and where we go from here. On behalf of the Institute and the City of Birmingham, and I'm going to take another liberty, I want you to meet our mayor, William Bell Sr., and members of our City Council. Would you guys please stand? I want you to see the kind of support that we have. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for hosting this wonderful program and presentation. My thanks to members of our Alabama congressional delegation, especially the Honorable Terry Sewell. Thank you so much. And the Honorable Spencer Barkas for their sponsorship of this medal presentation. Also a special thanks to our U.S. Senator, the Honorable Richard Shelby. And other members of the congressional leadership whose very presence today has such great meaning to us in Birmingham. Finally, I want to recognize the families of the 4 little girls who lost their lives on September 15. They represent the ones who paid the ultimate price for freedom. Through their eyes, their words, we understand the pain such a loss can bring. But even more, we understand the responsibility for telling the story and keeping it alive for future generations to hear, to experience, and to grow from. I am but a representative speaking for everyone gathered here with me. On their behalf, I pledge to treasure this Congressional Gold Medal, to care for it, to preserve it along with the precious memory of the lives it represents. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stand as the Chaplain of the United States House of Representatives, the Reverend Patrick Conroy, gives the benediction.
Let us pray. Blessed are you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah. You suffered the inhumanity of King Herod in the murder of your babes. So wrote St. Augustine so many centuries ago. He continued, "The death of these children is precious in the sight of God because of the beatitude they gained so quickly. For already at the beginning of their lives they pass on. The end of the present life was for them the beginning of glory." Dear God, these 50 years later, as people of faith and hope, we struggle still with the terrible death of such innocent ones. Addie Mae, Denise, Carol, Cynthia. And yet we trust that their unnecessary deaths and their blood spilled will continue to be the seed of ever greater equality and freedom in our nation. Blessed are you, Birmingham in Alabama. You suffered the inhumanity of racial hatred in the murder of your babes. Lord God, may the sacrifice of these young girls have a salvific effect in the healing of our nation's racial wounds. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain at your seats for the departure of the official party.
The Senate continues in a quorum call. Much of the day, the discussion dominated by what to do on Syria with the president's request for military authorization. A resolution is possibly pending. The president will be speaking tonight to the nation, 9 o'clock Eastern. We will have that for you live on C-SPAN. The day began in the Senate with, as usual, comments from the two leaders, Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell. And during his comments, Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, announced his opposition to the resolution. Here's what they had to say.
Mr. President, we're engaged in a very important debate. The Syria debate is one that can't be taken lightly, and I believe that no one has taken it lightly. The discussion and the bipartisan resolution under consideration is simply too important to be rushed through the Senate or given short shrift. So it's right and proper that the President be given an opportunity to meet with senators from both parties as he is today. He will meet with us at 12:30. When he finishes with us, it's my understanding he will report to the conference of Senator McConnell. In addition to that, he's going to address the nation tonight. He's going to speak directly to the American people about the potential for limited military action in Syria. He's going to do that at 9 o'clock tonight. As I said last night, it's appropriate to allow other conversations to go on. We now have, as a result of some work done by other countries, France, Russia, and we understand Syria is involved in this, and this is aimed at avoiding military action. We'll have to see if this works out. It's very important to understand that the only reason Russia is seeking an alternative to military action is that President Obama has made it plain and clear that the United States will act if we must. Our credible threat of force has made these diplomatic discussions with Syria possible. And the United States shouldn't withdraw from the direction we're taking as a country. If there's a realistic chance, and I certainly hope there is, to secure Syria's chemical weapons and prevent further atrocities of the Assad regime, we shouldn't turn our backs on that chance. But for such a solution to be plausible, the Assad regime must act quickly to prove their offer is real and not merely a ploy to delay military action or action of this body, the United States Senate. Any agreement must also assure chemicals weapons in the hands of Syria can be secured. And this can be done in an open process, even in the midst of this ongoing war that we have in Iraq. And any agreement must ensure that Syria is unable to transfer its dangerous chemical weapons to the hands of terrorists in that area. Such an attempt would be met with a rapid response, and it would be robust from the United States. So I'm pleased that the administration is considering this offer. I am pleased that other countries are involved, in addition to Russia. It's my understanding it's my understanding that France is heavily involved as of a few hours ago, and I think that's the right direction at this time. And we move forward, but under the general criteria that I have suggested and outlined. The Senate should give these international discussions time to play out, but not unlimited time. That's why, although there's support to move forward and debate this bipartisan resolution reported by Senators Menendez and Corker, they did a terrific job for the committee last week. I didn't rush to file cloture, as indicated last night, and a motion to proceed to this. We don't need to prove how quickly we can do this, but how well we can do this. The Syrian regime should fully understand that the United States is watching very, very closely. And the Assad regime should be warned. Our country will not tolerate this breach of human decency and long-held international consensus against the use of chemical weapons. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the order with respect to S-1392, which is the energy efficiency legislation, be modified so that the motion to proceed be agreed to at a time to be determined by me with the concurrence of the Republican leader, not consultation with him, but with concurrence with him.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
Mr. President, first I'd like to welcome the President to the Capitol today. Members on both sides of the aisle are eager to hear from him and to share their own thoughts. We look forward to a spirited and constructive exchange. It is often said that of all the questions we face as lawmakers, none is more serious or indeed more difficult than the question of whether to commit ourselves to military action. That's why it is so important for us to have this debate, to lay out the arguments for and against military action in Syria, to let the public know where we stand on this issue and why. But if debates like this are always challenging, in some ways this one has been even more difficult. Not because of some political calculus, though cynics will always suspect that. No, this debate has been made more difficult because even those of us who truly want to support the Commander-in-Chief have struggled to understand the purpose of the mission. Over the past several days, I've spoken with a lot of people, a lot of Kentuckians. And I have to tell you, most of them aren't exactly clear about the mission themselves, or shy about saying so. What I've told them is that I understand their concerns. I share them. I also appreciate the war weariness out there. But then I tell them there's other potential concerns that we can't ignore here either. Chief among them is the fact that the credibility of the Commander-in-Chief matters. And related to that is the fact that we can't afford as a country to withdraw from the world stage. So no one should be faulted for being skeptical about this proposal, regardless of what party they're in, or for being dumbfounded, literally dumbfounded at the ham-handed manner in which the White House announced it. There's absolutely no reason to signal to the enemy when and how and for how long you plan to strike them. None. As I've said before, you don't send out a save-the-date card to the enemy. And yet there are other important considerations to keep in mind here as well that go beyond the wisdom or the marketing of the proposal. I've spent a lot of time weighing all of these things. I've thought a lot about America's obligations and the irreplaceable role that I've always believed and still believe America plays in the world. And I've also thought a lot about the context, about this President's vision and his record, and what it says about whether we should be confident in his ability to bring about a favorable outcome in Syria. Because how we got to this point says a lot about where we may be headed. And that's why, before announcing my vote, I think it's important to look back at some of the President's other decisions on matters of foreign policy and national security, and then turn back to what he's proposing now in Syria, because in the end, these things simply can't be separated. Now, it's not exactly a state secret that I'm no fan of this President's foreign policy. On the deepest level, I think it comes down to a fundamentally different view of America's role in the world. Unlike the President, I've always been a firm and unapologetic believer in the idea that America isn't just another nation among many, that we are indeed exceptional. As I've said, I believe we have a duty as a superpower without imperialistic aims to help maintain an international order and balance of power that we and other allies have worked very hard to achieve over the years. The President, on the other hand, has always been a very reluctant Commander-in-Chief. We saw that in the rhetoric of his famous Cairo speech and in speeches he gave in other foreign capitals in the early days of his administration. The tone and the policies that followed were meant to project a humbler, more withdrawn America. And frankly, I'm hard-pressed to see any good that came from any of that. Any list would have to start with the arbitrary deadlines for military withdrawal and the triumphant declaration that Guantanamo would be closed within a year without any plan of what to do with its detainees. There were the executive orders that ended the CIA detention and interrogation programs. We all saw the so-called reset with Russia and how the President's stated commitment to a world without nuclear weapons led him to hastily sign an arms treaty with Russia that did nothing to substantially reduce its nuclear stockpile or its tactical nuclear weapons. We saw the President announce a strategic pivot to the Asia-Pacific region without any real plan to fund it and an effort to end the capture, interrogation, and detention of terrorists, as well as the return of an old idea that terrorism should be treated as a law enforcement matter. After a decade-long counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, we've seen the President's failure to invest in the kind of strategic modernization that's needed to make this pivot to Asia meaningful. Specifically, his failure to make the kind of investments that are needed to maintain our dominance in the Asia-Pacific theater, in the kind of naval, air, and Marine Corps forces that we'll need there in the years ahead, could have tragic consequences down the road. His domestic agenda has also obviously had serious implications for our global standing. While borrowing trillions and wasting taxpayer dollars here at home, the President has imposed a policy of austerity at the Pentagon that threatens to undermine our stabilizing presence around the globe. And of course, we've seen how eager the President is to declare an end to the war on terror. Unfortunately, the world just hasn't cooperated. They haven't cooperated with the President's vision or his hopes. Far from responding favorably to this gentler approach, it's become arguably more dangerous. We've learned the hard way that being nice to our enemies doesn't make them like you or clear a path to peace. I understand that the President ran for office on an anti-war platform, that his rise to political power was marked by a determination to get us out of Afghanistan and Iraq and declare an end to the war on terror. I know he'd rather focus on his domestic agenda, but the ongoing threat from al-Qaeda and its affiliates and the turmoil unleashed by uprisings in North Africa and the broader Middle East, not to mention the rise of Chinese military power, make it clear to me at least that this is not the time for America to shrink from the world stage. The world is a dangerous place. In the wake of the Arab Spring, large parts of the Sinai, of Libya, of Syria are now basically ungoverned. We've seen prison breaks in Iraq, Pakistan, Libya, and the release of hundreds of prisoners in Egypt. Terrorists have also escaped from prisons in Yemen, a country that is no more ready to detain the terrorists at Guantanamo now than they were back in 2009. And the flow of foreign fighters into Syria suggests that the civil war there will last for years, regardless of whether Assad is still in power. Yes, the President deserves praise for weakening al-Qaeda's senior leadership, but the threat we face from al-Qaeda affiliates is very real. These terrorists are adaptable. They're versatile, lethal, resilient, and they aren't going away. Pockets of these terrorists extend from North Africa to the Persian Gulf, and it's time he faced up to it. And it's time to face up to something else as well. International order is not maintained by some global police force, which only exists in a liberal fantasy. International order is maintained, its backbone is American military might. Which brings me back to Syria. For 2 years now, Syria has been mired in a ferocious civil war with more than 100,000 killed with conventional arms. That's according to UN estimates. This tragic situation has promoted many to look to the United States for help. And so 1 year ago, President Obama made a declaration. If Assad used or started moving chemical weapons, he'd do something about it. Well, as we all know, on August 21st of this year, that red line was crossed. The President's delayed response was to call for a show of force for targeted, limited strikes against the regime. We've been told that the purpose of these strikes is to deter and degrade Assad's regime's ability to use chemical weapons. So let's take a closer look at these aims. First, no one disputes that the atrocities committed in Syria in recent weeks are unspeakable. No one disputes that those responsible for these crimes against the innocent should be held to account. We were absolutely right, of course, to condemn these crimes. But let's be very clear about something. These attacks, monstrous as they are, were not a direct attack against the United States or one of its treaty allies. And just so there's no confusion, let me assure everyone that if a weapon of mass destruction were used against the U.S. or one of our allies, Congress would react immediately with an authorization for the use of force in support of an overwhelming response. I would introduce the resolution myself. So no leader in North Korea or Iran or any other enemy of the United States should take any solace if the U.S. were not to respond to these attacks with an action against Syria. We will never, never tolerate the use of chemical weapons against the United States or any of its treaty allies. Second, in the course of administration hearings and briefings over the past several days, Secretary of State Kerry has revealed that Assad has used chemical weapons repeatedly over the last year. So there's a further question here about why the administration didn't respond on those occasions. Third, Assad, as I've indicated, has killed tens of thousands of people with conventional weapons. Is there any reason to believe he won't continue if the President's strikes are as limited as we're told they would be? Fourth, what if degrading Assad's control of those weapons, if in doing that, you make it easier for other extremist elements like those associated with al-Nusra Front and al-Qaeda to actually get hold of them themselves? Or what if by weakening the Syrian military you end up tilting the military balance toward a fractured opposition that's in no position to govern or control anything right now? I think the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey, put this particular issue best when he recently suggested in a letter to Congress that the issue here isn't about choosing between two sides in Syria, it's about choosing one among many sides. And that in his estimation, even if we were to choose sides, the side we chose wouldn't be in a position to promote their own interest or ours.